Hello everyone and welcome to the third of our Influences on Parliament video, and we're going to talk in this instance about the media. We've already done two videos. The first one looked at the Law Commission and the work of the Law Commission on helping the government to create new legislation, and by help I'm implying the fact that there is an influence on Parliament. We also looked at pressure groups. And pressure groups were those sort of sectional and cause pressure groups that have a reason for change in the law and therefore lobby Parliament in order to do so. And the reason I've put those two up is to say that the media works in close conjunction with both of these. This is going to be quite a short video because there's not a huge amount to say, but it is an easy way. I'm talking about an AQA exam now. It is an easy way to pick up marks because there's not a great deal to say. There's not a huge amount to have to recall and remember on it, but what you do recall and remember score equally as well as any other influence on Parliament. So let's take a look. I'm going to come back to this Sun front page in a moment because it's quite an important front page for helping us to understand the power of the media as an influence on Parliament. But before I do that, I just want to clarify one or two things. The first thing to clarify is, what do we mean by media? And in this instance, we're going to say pretty much everything. So, as you can see I've got here, we're going to include television. We're going to include radio. We're going to include newsprint. And for some reason, the greatest influence on the way in which people think tends to be what we would know as the red tops, the tabloid newspapers. And that might be because they have large circulations. It might be because they appeal to the masses. I don't know, but they tend to have a greater sway on public opinion than perhaps the broadsheets do. It includes magazines, and here you can see I've got a cover of a glossy magazine, Vogue. But don't think that just because it's glossy and pretty that it doesn't have a serious, or can't have a serious impact on the way in which Parliament thinks. I'll give you an example. Gok Wan had a recent campaign on body image. That featured very little in the newsprint. It did feature on TV. He had a whole programme and a whole series of programmes. It didn't feature on radio, but it certainly featured in a number of glossy magazines, particularly female-based magazines. And third, of course, we have what has now become the ubiquitous internet. And more and more and more we're seeing the internet now creep into forms of media. If you look at things like the Huffington Post, which is a notorious online newspaper which has a great amount of sway in terms of opinion. So when we talk about media in this video, we're talking about pretty much every single form of media that you can think about. So don't be just concerned with TV, is what I'm trying to say. The next thing to consider is that there is a direct link between the media and public opinion. And what I mean by that is that the media is able to control to a certain extent the way in which the public think. Now some would say, and I'm sure the media themselves would say, that they reflect public opinion. But that's certainly not the case, as you can see from our headline newspaper here. This is a very famous Sun newspaper front page from April 1992. And in April 1992, the Tory government, or the Tory party, won a surprise election victory. They were expected to lose. And the Sun claimed, in its famous headline, "It's the Sun what won it." Now, that's not strictly true for those students of government and politics, but nevertheless the Sun felt that with its 5 million readers they were able to swing the electorate by coming out on the side of the Tories. So to that extent the Sun's opinion was able to change public opinion, or so the Sun would have you believe. I am certainly aware that my own father's opinion changes on what he's read in the Daily Mail this week. So there is a direct influence between the media and what the public think. So just keep that in mind as we work through this video. The third thing to say is that the media enables a two-way communication between the public and government. So from government, the media allows the government to demonstrate its policy. So the government will test its policy. The government will, if they have an idea that they think that they might want to run with, they'll allow the media to push that out to the masses, and the masses, or the reaction of the public, will then give them some idea as to whether or not that policy will be successful. On the same, or the other side of the same coin, of course, public opinion is able to be pushed back to government. And we'll have a look at an example of that in a moment. But very, very easily, the media can report on what the public are thinking, which may be able to give government some insight as to future policy and what they think they can do and can't get away with. So there's a two-way symbiotic relationship between government and the public, which is accessed, if you like, through various media. The government will use the media to get its message across to the public, and the public will use the media to get its thoughts, its views, its ideas across to government. The fourth area that I want to talk to you about is that pressure groups often use media. And by all means, go back to the pressure group video and look at what we have been talking about, what sort of pressure groups we've been talking about. And I've used a very current example at the moment. Most of you will know that there is a big issue around fracking. So we're talking about fracking. And fracking is the ability to extract natural gas from shale rock by the use of high pressure water injection. And the problem with that is that the anti-fracking campaign would say that it's not very green, it's not environmentally friendly, and some would say it's downright dangerous. There is a belief that fracking causes minor earthquakes, for instance. On the other hand of the story, of course, it means that we as a country, if we were able to take this fuel out of the ground, would become self-sustaining in terms of our natural gas usage. The anti-frackers here have frequently used the media to be able to get their message across. Now, I'm not suggesting for one moment that the BBC are in league with the anti-fracking campaign, but you can see how very quickly a headline similar to "fracking tests near Blackpool are the likely cause of tremors" would help to support the pressure group that wants fracking stopped. Similarly so, those papers that are supporting of the process would be used by the pro-fracking campaign. So pressure groups frequently use the media to get what they want. Another good examples would be the unions as pressure group frequently use the Daily Mirror, because the Daily Mirror, as we all know, is a left-wing newspaper, a great supporter of the working class person and a great supporter of the unions. So the unions would use the Daily Mirror to get their message across to the public. So pressure groups often use the media. And the next big thing that I want to talk to you about is that newspapers frequently campaign to change the law. Now, I'm just going to spend some time talking through this element, and I'm going to add some extras just to demonstrate some additional examples. But I'm going to focus especially on the News of the World campaign to create what's known as Sarah's Law. And Sarah's Law is a byproduct of something called Megan's Law. And Megan's Law is a US Megan's Law is a US initiative in which local or paedophiles who are local to a community should be, or the list of paedophiles that live locally in a community should be published so as the local community know where those people who are deemed to be dangerous to children live and reside within the community. It's known as Megan's Law in the US. And in the UK, the News of the World, following the murder by a paedophile of a young girl called Sarah Payne, created and campaigned for Sarah's Law to be brought into force. And you can see here the way in which the News of the World and the Sun, of course both related newspapers, the Sun used to run Monday to Saturday, the News of the World was its Sunday counterpart. But you can see here how the Sun readers, or the Sun, is pushing this campaign. 99% demand Sarah's Law. After Sarah's Law was initiated, the News of the World then ran continuing stories to say, and this is this young girl's mother saying, that the News of the World is a force for good in the world. You can see another campaign here. The Sun is running a campaign to end soft sentences. So newspapers often campaign to change the law. There are another couple that I'm going to tell you about. In fact, what I'll do is I'll move across and we'll look at the third area here. We'll look at how several influences frequently work together. And what I mean is, here I've got the Law Commission, and I'll talk about that one first, and then I'll look at some pressure groups and the way in which some pressure groups have worked together. So, in this instance, we are talking about something known as the double jeopardy rule. And the double jeopardy rule basically said that if you had been tried for a criminal offence and found not guilty, then you could not be tried for that same offence again. That would be double jeopardy. And Stephen Lawrence, as most people will know the story of Stephen Lawrence, so I'm not going to repeat it here. His suspected killers at the time were tried criminally and they were acquitted. There was a huge amount of media pressure as a result of that acquittal. And at the same time, the Law Commission started to look at the Double Jeopardy Act. And the reason for that was that new evidence came to light. But under the old rule, because his suspected killers had been acquitted, they could not be brought back to court. The newspapers applied media pressure, the Law Commission applied its pressure, and the result was the Criminal Justice Act 2003. And what that said was that if there was any compelling, it's a key word, compelling new evidence. My writing is so bad, I'm sorry. So after compelling new evidence, there could be a second trial. So media pressure and the Law Commission helped to bring about what's known as a new double jeopardy rule. And that became about through statute, the Criminal Justice Act 2003. So you can see here how influences on Parliament actually work. There are two more. One is the Snowdrop campaign. And the Snowdrop campaign came about as a result of the Dunblane shootings, and that was in 1992, I believe. No, it wasn't, I'm sorry. It was in 1996. And in 1996, a man walked into a school in Dunblane in Scotland. Incidentally, it's the same school that Andy Murray went to, and I think that Andy Murray was actually present in the school at the time. And the man went mad with a gun, and we see this quite a lot in the States, but actually it happened here in 1996 in Dunblane. 16 children and 1 teacher were killed. 12 more children and 2 more teachers were injured. At the conclusion of that shooting, the gunman shot himself. The campaign by a number of pressure groups in the media, so not the Law Commission this time, so you've got the media plus pressure groups campaigned to ban handguns. And the campaign was so powerful that Michael Howard introduced what were probably the toughest gun laws, certainly in Europe, if not over a large part of the world. They were enormously tough. And there are some good parts and some bad parts about that, and I don't want to get into discussing the politics of the result of the Snowdrop campaign, but what we need to look at is how powerful media pressure and pressure groups were to produce a change in government policy about the use of handguns. And the second case that I want to talk to you about is the Zito campaign. And the Zito campaign is something that occurred, or is a campaign that occurs after the year 2000. And in 2000, a man called Chris Clunis killed Jonathan Zito. Chris Clunis had been released from a psychiatric institution. He had severe schizophrenia, and one night on a night bus in London, he killed Jonathan Zito for no real reason, no reason at all. And Jonathan Zito's wife, I think her name was Jane Zito, created a trust called the Zito Trust, which looked at the how we deal with psychiatric offenders. And again, the Zito campaign and the Zito Trust was caused changes, significant changes in the way in which we treat psychiatric patients and psychiatric convicted prisoners through the use of media and pressure groups. Okay, so that's pretty much all that you would need to write, those 5 key issues. What do we mean by media? Let's run through that. What do we mean by media? The link between media and public opinion. The fact that the media enables a two-way communication between public and government. You would then need to talk about the pressure groups frequently use in the media to get what they want, and we've seen a couple of examples of that. You would need to talk about newspapers campaigning themselves to change the law. And I'm going to talk about that when we look at advantages and disadvantages in a moment. And then finally, how several different influences work together to change or to influence Parliament to change the law. So that only leaves us one more thing to do, really, and that's just to take a quick look at the advantages and disadvantages of the media as an influence on Parliament. And this is where marks become very easy to get, because there are so few advantages and disadvantages. The advantages are thus: the first thing is that it raises government's awareness. That's why I use the forklift trust. It's a bit cheesy as a picture, but it raises government awareness. The media can help members of the government to see what the public are thinking. Now, they may already know the issues, they just might not know how deeply concerned the public are. Or alternatively, it may introduce them to something that they had no idea about, but which the public do have a great deal of empathy for. So it helps to raise government awareness. And the media also helps to raise public awareness. Now, that can be public awareness of government policy. And as we've said, we've spoken about fracking already in this video. We will start to see played out more and more as the government, George Osborne at the moment, the present Chancellor, is a huge fan of fracking and the obtaining of natural gas through that medium. We will see the government start to use the media more and more and more to help to raise public awareness about the issues. And I read The Sun yesterday, and even in The Sun yesterday there was a big one-page spread about how if we were to obtain gas through fracking, that what it would do was be to help some of the poorest people in this country. Now, I'm not making a political judgment on that statement, but what that is a clear example of the government using the media to try to raise public awareness about the good that fracking can do. Now, what about the disadvantages? Well, The first is that newspapers can become politicised. Here, it's not here for the Tiger Woods picture, even though it's the most prominent, but here you can see that the Daily Telegraph is very much about supporting the Tory party. Similarly so, the Times has become more and more Tory as the years have gone on. And you tend to have a political scale for newspapers. On the left, the more socialist newspapers tend to be the Daily Mirror and the Guardian. In the middle ground, the claim is that the independent newspaper would tend to sit. And to the right, you would tend to have at the moment the Sun, the Telegraph, and the Times. What that means is that if newspapers become politicised, if they have a political party that they follow, they become biased. And if they are trying to raise awareness, the awareness that they try to raise also becomes biased. So you tend not to get a clear picture and all of the arguments. The second is that newspapers are out to make money and have clear agendas. That means that sometimes they do not report fairly. Now here we see the Daily Express, and I'll include the Daily Mail in this too, have frequently, every chance that they've had, discussed the unfortunate and untimely death of Princess Diana. Only recently, in the last week or so, there's been another conspiracy story emerge about the death of the princess. Now the Mail and the Express have jumped straight on that, even though several courts, French courts, have said very clearly the reason for her death was X. The Mail, the Express tend to have an agenda about, for some reason, continuing to hold the conspiracy theory. What that does is it doesn't make for objective. So I'll say objective, but I'll put a cross through it because it doesn't create objective reporting. It's not the media working at its best to help inform us as the public. And the third, which is the one that's probably the most disturbing, is that frequently the media, and I'm talking now particularly about the tabloid media, can be very quick to whip up moral panic. And there's a good example of that. We discussed the Name and Shame campaign. One of the downsides of that, there was a story that happened not long after the success of the Name and Shame campaign, in which, and I can't spell these words, so please excuse me, but a paediatrician was chased home and a paediatrician is somebody that treats children. She's a doctor or a doctor that treats children. And a paediatrician was chased home by a mob and had her house daubed in paint because people who were unable to distinguish between the difference between a paediatrician and a paedophile. And they thought that this woman who they understood to be a paediatrician, they thought was a paedophile. And so what you end up doing is you create a mob mentality if you're not careful. And the papers have in the past been able to whip up this moral panic. The only last thing I wanted to add here is I've said newspapers can become politicised. The radio and TV, by law, have to remain neutral. So the BBC has to remain politically neutral. A good example of this is when they run party political broadcasts. If they run the Tory party one day, they have to run the Labour Party the next day, and then the Liberal Democrats, and then UKIP, and then the Greens. They have to remain politically neutral. They cannot be seen to support a political party. Newspapers, however, do not have that same restriction, which is why they become politicized. So the disadvantages are they can become politicized, they're out to make money and have a agenda, and therefore their reporting sometimes is not objective. And finally, there is the chance to whip up moral panic quite easily and create a mob mentality. So, interesting. Parliamentary lawmaking as an influence, the media as an influence on parliamentary lawmaking, is an interesting part of the law. Please don't overlook it. It's easy to remember the 5 key areas. It's easy to remember the advantages and disadvantages, and therefore the marks that you can score are straightforward and simple.